I just wanted to reflect a little bit about using, I suppose, community engagement within your civic agreement, because obviously a lot of you are developing civic agreements, and really to try and link it to a couple of principles. And just to say that what I'm going to focus in on is not by any means the full spectrum or the final word on community engagement, as it never could be, but really, I suppose, to get us thinking a little bit about why we're doing community engagement and where it's starting from. So I just wanted to reflect a little bit, and we at the Institute have a typology of community engagement, and this is built very much from the ground up in terms of feedback from communities, feedback from people working with communities on different issues, but also from an increasing, I suppose, observatory of different case studies that we're bringing together. And I suppose where we're driven from is very much from being helpful and being useful in terms of making community engagement more effective for communities, but also to, for the ends that everybody is trying to use it for. And I just wanted to reflect on kind of three parts of that typology. And again, it's part of a much broader one. And if you want to find out a bit more, you can also, there's a toolkit which has been produced, which is now on the members area site for the Civic University Network, which I would encourage you, if you're really interested in community engagement, to go there after this. But the 3 points I wanted to reflect on were particularly around how we talk and the language that we use when we're talking about communities in our civic agreements or in our university life. So, for example, here we've got a sense of being engaged in, and we often talk about, sort of communities being engaged in our work. And just thinking about what we mean when we're saying that. And often what we mean is that we're starting from a point where actually and that could mean, a local authority, it could mean somebody running a charity, it could mean someone, sort of running a program at a university. We know what we want to be doing, but because we understand and we recognise, from a positive position that it will have implications for the local area, we talk about communities being engaged in our work. And I suppose I just wanted to put that up next to engaging with and engaging for, because really what we're talking about is a kind of spectrum, and there's no right or wrong answer or sort of in terms of doing community engagement, but I think there are, for different contexts, better places to start sometimes. And I think Dan's kind of opening presentation really demonstrates an aspect of that. And sometimes we don't want to necessarily start from the idea of communities being engaged in what we're doing, but perhaps from the other 2 points on my screen, one being around engaging with. So perhaps we have an idea of an issue, or we have a question that's affecting the local area that's been, and it may have been identified either jointly or it may be identified by the university. So for example, I was talking the other day with a university who knows there's a huge problem around poverty in their local area. They've done a lot of research around this. They want to now work more closely with the local community. But crucially, where they are starting from is this point of engaging with. So rather than developing a whole program or developing a whole strategy around that, they are first and foremost getting out to decide what is the specific angles of this problem, what do we not know, or what assumptions are we holding about both what the exact issue is and how to solve it. And I would encourage, as far as possible, the engaging with is a really good place to start from your civic agreement. We're not going to sit here and say that people don't know what the issues are in their local areas or communities, because a lot of the universities have an excellent insight about this, but perhaps problematizing that before you start to form kind of an idea of what's within the scope of your civic agreement, and actually going out and asking, are these the right issues, having those deep conversations, and then kind of taking, sort of from that, the insights to form a more rounded approach of what the scope of that agreement is going to be. And particularly, I think that's very important in terms of deciding what are we going to do. So what activities will flow from these, and these being led from that engaging with principles. So they are genuinely built with the community's input at the start, because I think that can really, it's a point about building trust, but also it can really lead to stronger and more sustainable relationships later. And then the final part is about engaging for, which really is around, I suppose, this is kind of towards the end of our spectrum in terms of the most kind of handing over of all power to the community, really. And of course, that isn't suitable for all contexts, that isn't suitable for all situations, but we are seeing an increasing number of people who want to really be led from what would be the best thing for the university to do for the community. And of course, you do have to have a huge amount of support there strategically to do this, but it doesn't have to be the whole scope of your agreement. It could just be one part. And really that means, you know, going out with a genuinely open book and saying we want to make a contribution, but we'll be led by what the community identify are the issues, and then decide collectively with them how to solve them. And so the reason this spectrum I think is helpful, and again, you know, there's further information in the toolkit, is that it gives you different points that you could start from. And again, you know, none of them are right or wrong, but the engaging with or engaging for tend to be, we find, ones that mean that the relationship doesn't run into as many complications later. So just moving to my next slide, I think what I just wanted to illustrate from this is the sense of, sorry, it jumped on twice there, the sense of kind of how do we know what the issues are in our local area, and where can community engagement form a really important part of that. And of course, because, you know, we're working in universities, we have the advantage of a lot of knowledge and insight and expertise, and of course the university is a part of the community as well. But it's really about that sense of knowing and thinking about what kinds of information, and we talked about this in terms of data last time, but what kind of insights, you know, sort of are really helpful, and what forms of knowledge can become, you know, sort of part of your civic agreement. And of course, at the Institute, we look a lot at community voice. There's lots of different ways of doing that, as you'll see in the community engagement toolkit. But there's also, you know, sort of different forms. If you're, and again, they follow a spectrum. So for example, social media campaigns, enabling people to do user generated content that asks them to reflect about your university, for example, or to reflect about the issues in the local area, giving over resources that enable people to do their own community archiving, their own community inquiries, you know, that enable them to basically co-produce knowledge about the local area, can be a really effective way of then sort of shaping that engaging with and engaging for. So I guess it's not just about kind of coming in with your approach that enables, you know, sort of people to then take part, but also kind of how can you hand over who is producing the knowledge, and in what kind of creative or imaginative ways that are also an experience for the local community to take part in, or indeed to lead. So that was the main kind of focus for that sort of slide in terms of principles. And then the final one is to draw these really into a set of principles, and we have what we call a kind of working set of principles. So they change and they are added to frequently around community engagement. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of those here, which are the idea that engagement should be ongoing. So you know, we work a lot with different you know, sort of local authorities and charities, and also with government around engagement to form a specific strategy, or engagement to form a specific agenda. But the idea is that quite often that can be a standalone activity, and it's never reflected on, iterated, or returned to. And often that leaves communities, as I'm sure you're all aware, feeling quite disenfranchised. So the idea that engagement is ongoing, and actually this should really reduce the pressure in a lot of situations on your engagement with communities. If you can build it in as an ongoing plan of activities over a number of years, it becomes, you know, again, a relationship builder, a trust builder, but also enables you to respond more readily to how you know, the issues are emerging and how your community is changing on the ground. Another one I just wanted to highlight was the point around being an equal partner, so generating insight and ideas, and also seeing how you can rebalance, you know, sort of what might be power imbalances between university and community, and that links very much to the knowledge point for my previous slide. And then the final one is thinking about the assets and strengths within a community. And I thought the way that Dan looked at, you know, sort of the number of charities and how can you showcase where there are local charities doing fantastic work, but also that extends to where there might be people running, you know, sort of other arts-based initiatives, sports-based initiatives. You know, how can you be generous with your platform, but also see where there are strengths and assets that are happening within your local community that might be very small scale, but if you linked up with them and perhaps you help to support and grow their profile, that can sometimes be better than launching your own set of activities to run alongside it. So just a point in terms of recognising community strength there. And so all of these principles are in the toolkit. There are a couple more as well, but I didn't want to bombard. basically. But that was a whistle-stop tour through a couple of bits of food for thought that draw on the presentations that you're about to hear as well. And thank you again, and very, very happy to take questions after the next 2 case studies as well related to this, or indeed to the case studies that we'll move on to. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Emily. Jack, maybe you could take the slides down now. That would be great. And yeah, we will share all of these slides with you afterwards. And I've posted a link to the Community Engagement Toolkit that's in the members area. But Emily, I just wondered if you wanted to just say a little bit more about what is in the toolkit for people. And please, while Emily's doing that, if you've got a question or a comment, please use the chat or put your hand up.
Yeah, so in the toolkit, I mean, we've aimed for it to be as practical as possible. And again, there will be more that's added to this, but there's a number of different case studies, I suppose, demonstrating how this works in practice, thinking very much about where it's led from. So consistently, you know, what's the purpose, who is involved, what's the budget, you know, what's the scope of each of those kind of forms of engagement? Because I think what we really wanted to emphasize was the sense of the diversity of different approaches that you can take. I think there's often, and we find this as well, there's often seen as kind of there's one route or there's best routes, and actually that's not at all the case. So there's a diversity of examples in there. There's practical ideas of how to, you know, sort of get going, I guess, and there's also signposting to different other you know, I suppose databases, but also kind of repositories where you can find more case studies if they're in a particular area. So if you're looking particularly, if your university has a strength in health, or if your university has a strength in social or environmental issues, we've aimed to really kind of think about where can you be led from in your community engagement, and to make it as practical as possible.
Yeah, and I wonder, Emily, whether you could also just say a little bit about the community engagement the Institute for Community Studies has done recently, and the publication of your kind of research agenda that you did fairly recently, but that was built on a really sort of in-depth process of community engagement. And I'll pop a link to that in the chat in a minute, but it would be lovely to hear just a bit more about how you went about that.
Absolutely. So we spent 7 months building a co-created research agenda with communities for communities. And really the first stage of that was working out, did people think this was a good idea? So the bit that's lesser kind of known about the co-created agenda, which is called Safety in Numbers, because it is supposed to kind of play with that idea of which data is valued and important within how we shape kind of initiatives for communities. So it was led very much from our community advisory board, recognizing that at the time people think they know what should be being researched, acted upon, put into policy for communities, and wouldn't it be interesting if we actually went out with a clean slate and said, if we ask communities what matters and what should be acted upon and researched and engaged on, wouldn't it be an interesting exercise? So it was led from our community advisory board, and we then took up the mantle, put our resources behind it, and formed a very open approach, which had a diversity of different methods. So we had a huge online qualitative exercise where people could literally send in their anecdotes, and we were really asking what had changed in their communities, what were the questions that remained unanswered about that, and you know, what as a result did they think was important to act upon. And that threw up a lot of well-known issues, but really different perspectives on them. So people are, you know, highlighting that what had happened, for example, due to austerity in their communities in the last few years, but asking, what does this mean for the responsibility that lies in different parts of society? And of course, when we then took that to our profession, you know, our academic and professional advisory board, you know, that was a question that perhaps had been in the background and hadn't been as much in the foreground of some of their work. So I suppose it was providing different insights on well-known issues, but also then it threw up a lot of different issues that I think hadn't come out as much before. And so we built a huge online kind of engagement. We did in-depth place-based groups to really look through the lens of place, and we did a number of more kind of ethnographic lived experience methods as well, and really the sense that every point was being led by how people told us it was best to ask the questions rather than assuming that we had the answer to that. And we're now in the process of turning that into a living model, because obviously we're very keen that it doesn't become just a static moment in time, and the pandemic has changed that. And it's about taking some of the issues that came out, testing that they're still relevant, and the most important ones, such as the definition of safety, which was one of the key ones, has changed completely now, but also things like the environment, and the future of local economies, for example. And our next stage is to turn those into almost kind of I suppose areas of interest cards, essentially, which a lot of people will be familiar with from the academic world, but kind of community areas of interest cards, and then building consortiums of support around them. So I mean, that's there's lots of different ways that people can use this, but just a little bit of our experience of trying this out.